Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Vasquez. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the Religion Faith Director at the Human Rights Campaign. Thank you for joining us for the second installment of our Pilgrimage to Justice series, Catholic Lenten Reflections on LGBTQ Equity, brought to you by HRC and DignityUSA. Our panelists today are Michael Lachlan, who is a national correspondent for America Magazine and host of America podcast Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS in the Catholic Church. He's a journalist, commentator, and speaker who covers religion and politics with a particular focus on the Catholic Church. Michael's also the author of the forthcoming book, Hidden Mercy, AIDS in the Catholic Church. Welcome, Michael. We also have Father Dennis Holtschneider, who is the president of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, support organization for the work of the nation's over 200 Catholic universities. From 2004 to 2017, Father Dennis served as president of DePaul University, the nation's largest Catholic university, long known for its support for the LGBTQ community. Welcome, Father Dennis. And then Father Bryan Massingale holds the James and Nancy Buckman Chair in Applied Christian Ethics at Fordham University. A priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, he is a leader in Catholic theology and ethics as the current president-elect of the Society of Christian Ethics, a past convener of the Black Catholic Theologian Symposium, and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He is the author of the award-winning book, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, and a public intellectual who frequently addresses issues of racial and sexual justice. Welcome, Father Bryan. Last week, in our first webinar to kick off the series, we discussed the broad issues facing LGBTQ Catholics in pursuit of non-discrimination. And today our topic is respect and compassion, LGBTQ Catholic youth and the future of the Catholic Church. In its teachings on homosexuality, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that LGBTQ people, though intrinsically disordered, are to be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. The Trevor Project estimates that at least one LGBTQ youth in America, ages 13 to 24, attempt suicide every 45 seconds. The CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Report, analyzed by the Human Rights Campaign, found that many LGBTQ youth continue to suffer higher health and suicide risk than their peers. The data shows that 43% of transgender youth have been bullied on school property, 29% of transgender youth, 21% of gay and lesbian youth, and 22% of bisexual youth have attempted suicide. This is compared to 17% of cisgender youth who reported bullying and 7% of cisgender youth who have attempted suicide. The Trevor Project released a brief in 2020 that showed that LGBTQ youth who report not hearing their parents use religion to say negative things about being LGBTQ were at a significantly reduced risk for attempting suicide. These numbers are grim, and there is no question that religion plays a major role in the well-being of children, and negative messages compounding with bullying and other factors have played a significant part in undermining the welfare of LGBTQ youth. And so while there have been major strides within and outside the Catholic Church towards greater LGBTQ support, respect, compassion, and equality, much work remains to be done, as these numbers show us that LGBTQ youth are still at great risk. Michael, you were a student at St. Anselm. You were at a Catholic school, also like same as me, right? Went to a Catholic school for undergrad. Can you talk about what your experience as a gay student was there and what you've seen shift since your time at St. Anselm?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, thanks for hosting this panel today. The statistics you cited are certainly sobering, and obviously there's a lot of need for affirming voices, and the work you do at HRC is helping to fill that. So thanks for kind of putting this panel together in this series. Yeah, I graduated St. Anselm College, which is a small Benedictine school in New Hampshire, back in 2007. And I actually wrote an essay back in 2013 for a journal called Religion and Politics, where I went to different Catholic campuses throughout the country to look at what resources were offered for LGBT students on campus. And this was, 2013, so a couple of years before marriage equality becomes kind of the law of the land in the United States. And I find there's a big range in terms of services and resources for students. I visited DePaul University here in Chicago and learned about kind of their, I would say, pretty early entry into providing robust services for students, for LGBT students. St. Anselm was sort of somewhere in the middle, where there was a group of students pushing for LGBT resources, The school responded by creating a program that was housed in campus ministry. The idea being that that way kind of church teaching on the issue wouldn't be challenged because there would be some control over what could be talked about and what could be pushed for, all the way to other end of the spectrum where there were several Catholic schools that kind of barred students from organizing and said that there were sufficient resources for all students and there didn't need to be special LGBT groups. So this is back in 2013, so I wasn't surprised that there was a range. And kind of just getting ready for this panel and, still covering LGBT issues in the church, I discovered that there's been a fair bit of progress, I think. Many Catholic schools, Catholic universities and colleges have offices and programs and resources committed to LGBT students. Even at the Catholic University of America, which I had been covering back in 2013, there had been a group of students pushing for a group. The school denied their request. Back in 2015, I covered a story where the university actually canceled a screening of the Harvey Milk biopic because they said it kind of went against church teaching. So that kind of created some controversy. But I just read ahead of this call that the Student Government Association at Catholic University last month actually overwhelmingly passed a resolution calling for the creation of an LGBT student group. So I think there's progress even in places where there might be some anxiety about recognizing student groups or providing resources. But I do have to say, I think the landscape has improved and students are getting access to resources and schools are not only kind of tolerating these groups, but welcoming the gifts that LGBT students and LGBT Catholics are bringing to their university communities.
That's great. And I think it's interesting about that is that we just saw the new Public Religious Research Institute data that was released this week showing an overwhelming support for non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people from Catholics. Over 80% of Catholics support those kinds of protections. Do you think, like from your reporting and from your experience, do you see a disconnect between the experiences, right? Like some of what we're seeing on campus at the college and university level, and some of the statistics around suicidality of LGBTQ youth?
It's been interesting. I've been covering these topics for about a decade now, and Catholics have always been kind of among the Catholic support for LGBT issues, if we're talking marriage equality or, more lately, like non-discrimination laws. Catholics have kind of as a group supported these things at higher rates than most other religious groups in the United States, which I think can be surprising because you look at a lot of the news about what some Catholic leaders are saying about LGBT issues, and it feels like there's some hostility there. But then you look at Catholics as a group, and there is a lot of support there. So I don't know if there's a disconnect, but there's certainly some kind of debate taking place where the Catholic laity seem to be moving in one direction in this country, and where Catholic leadership is. So I'm not sure. I interviewed a bishop earlier this week who came out in favor of the Equality Act, which is sort of a minority position among U.S. bishops. And I asked him, how do you reconcile that issue? And he said he's not sure. He thinks that dialogue is important and that church leaders, Catholic leaders should be, listening to the lived experiences of LGBT people. And we're seeing some of that happening. So yes, there is some tension there, but I think that as long as dialogue continues, we'll have to just be open to seeing what kind of progress is possible.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Father Dennis, you lead the organization of the presidents of these Catholic colleges, universities, and like Michael said, right, there's been some significant strides made towards greater inclusion. Can you talk about your decision, right, when you were at DePaul to support the creation of an LGBTQ studies program, and how you see that shift impacting colleges, universities today?
Sure. Like Michael graciously noted, DePaul had kind of a student organization since the late 1960s. So it had been a very long time, and it had become part and parcel of the campus community in a way that people just recognized and just took for granted as part of the campus culture. But back in 2004, I was barely in the office a few days when the dean called from the Arts and Sciences and said that they had a working plan to create an academic program in LGBTQ studies, and would I support it? And so I did what I always do, is I told him I would call him back. I actually spoke with the Cardinal of Chicago at that time, to let him know what was happening because I never liked him to be surprised. And then he surprised me. Cardinal George was nobody's liberal in the church, but he had worked at universities much of his life. And what he said to me was, I want your promise and your guarantee that the Catholic Church's position will be fairly taught. It won't be put up as a straw man so it can be kicked down. I want real intellectual engagement with the issues we're putting forward on humanity. He said, if you can promise me that students actually will be exposed to the depth of that thought, then I think it's reasonable that all other thought is also put forward at a university. It actually worked, but there was another reason that I supported it. I was glad to have his support, but back, I must have been 35, or at least not 40 yet, when Helen Vendler's commentary on Shakespeare's sonnets was released. Now, I had thought I knew Shakespeare. I had read all the required readings when I was in school, but I started just from my own enjoyment reading her commentary each night. And I suddenly realized that that poem I thought I knew all these years, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer Day, that I had no idea who thee was. And of course, that 126 of those poems are written to a young man. And I began to realize my teachers had to know that when they were teaching me these poems years ago. But the anthology that we learned Shakespeare's poems from never told us that. My teachers never told us that. And I realized I didn't want Paul to participate in the cover-up. People have been loving in all different ways for centuries, and it had been very carefully just not spoken about. And at a university of any stature whatsoever, we study the world in its fullness and its complexity. And any university worth its salt should study the world in its fullness and its complexity. And that has to do with the human experience of sexuality as well. And so I said yes, and I supported them, and they ran with it. Now, let's be honest, presidents don't do a lot of the work. It's the people on the ground that built this program, and they built a wonderful program. But that was the reason we supported it, because any university worth its salt should do that. Since that time, I've come to be glad that we did it for another reason. And that's the reason you started this interview with, Michael. And that was the stress that LGBTQ students experience without even mentioning it. It is enormous pain for a person to think that, to get to the point that they would think of ending their life. The amount of pain in that one life is stunning. And think of how many lives there are when you think of the statistics you quoted just a few minutes ago. And there is something to do with that about a university that's keeping quiet, not even mentioning the people are there, or only bringing one part of the debate to bear. People need to see themselves, and they need to see their lives, and we need to engage the questions as full members of the community. There needs to be a level of empathy and listening and study and debate and everything as full members of the human community. And so I'm glad that we brought all of that to bear in the intellectual enterprise as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot there that's super interesting, but in particular, one thing that stands out, it's like when I was in a Catholic undergrad, I remember being at a roundtable discussion with our campus ministry about LGBTQ inclusion. And now this was a school run by sisters, and we had one priest on campus. So classically incredibly liberal Catholic school in Massachusetts. And I remember asking, right, as a closeted gay student, right, like, so what, but the Bible does say this, that, and the other thing, right, about homosexuality. And I remember the priest responding, like, super interestingly, he was just like, no, it doesn't say any of that. It doesn't say anything. And that was weird, right? Like, it was weird for me in the moment, right? Because I'm like, I definitely just read this, right? Like, I read this often. And I get that what he was attempting to do was to, like, you know, let's pivot to a more inclusive posture and a more inclusive dialogue. And so I appreciate that, and I value that deeply. But I value what you said about creating the space, right, to have a full conversation, and not, right, diminishing, right, the life and dignity of LGBTQ students by ignoring that we're in the room, or ignoring that the Bible does say certain things and the Catechism says certain things, and let's unpack what that means and what it can mean. What did you, could you share a little bit, Father Dennis, about what you saw shift right after this program was instituted and some of these other policies around non-discrimination, either at DePaul or other schools? Like, what has the impact been for LGBTQ students?
There have been additional, there's always been courses in the curriculum because faculty create courses. And so that wasn't new when we got started. But we started having other campuses visit us to say, how do you actually put an academic program around that? And people, the faculty from one university talk to another. And there are some other programs in the country today. So if anything, it gave people a chance to think about the practice by watching it somewhere else. And we were always happy to provide what we had learned along the way.
That's great. Thank you. Father Bryan, as a theologian and an ethicist, I'm curious if you could share a bit about, as the church is struggling and wrestling with itself more than anything else, right? I would argue. And there's a large public debate, right, around what does it mean for us to advance non-discrimination protections in the public square in matters of employment, housing, public accommodation, credit, education for LGBTQ people. Given the numbers, right, we talked about the grim reality that LGBTQ youth, young adults are facing. Can you talk about the ethics of non-discrimination and what is there a moral impetus for Catholics to push this forward both on campuses and more broadly in the public square?
Well, thank you. And thank you for hosting this important discussion. The numbers that you began with are not just grim, they're tragic. And I think that needs to inform how Catholics engage the efforts toward non-discrimination in society. I think the starting point is the fundamental dignity of every human person as created in the image and likeness of God. And I think we start from that perspective that everyone has a fundamental human dignity, and that means that they enjoy in Catholic teaching, access to fundamental human rights, including the right to participate fully in society. And that right needs to be protected and fostered and promoted. You talk about the Catechism of the Catholic Church and its teaching about compassion. And I think it's important for us to understand that justice is what compassion sounds like in public. And so for some in the Catholic Church to have a position of, well, I'm going to be compassionate and sensitive and respecting of LGBTQ persons, but I draw the line at defending their human rights, well, that's inherently contradictory. That if I respect someone, if I'm having compassion for someone, then I have to protect that person's rights to life, to education, to all those things that they need to fully flourish as a human person. And especially in a Catholic position, in a Catholic world, because we believe in one of the principles of Catholic social teaching is the protection of the lives of the poor and the vulnerable. You can't get much more vulnerable, I would argue, than being an LGBTQ teenager or young adult, many of whom are still trying to wrestle and come to a deeper understanding of what their sexuality is, and to try to create that environment where they can flourish without having the added pressures of social ostracism or discrimination or having their lives endangered. And I think we can't underestimate that we still live in a country where people feel that their physical safety is compromised simply because of who they love or how they express love or how they express their sexuality. That cannot be reconciled with a Christian understanding of morality or ethics. And I think that becomes the moral imperative then for Catholics to be not just tolerant of efforts toward non-discrimination, but to be full-throated in, supporters of such efforts. And there, as we said, there's a big conversation about that going on now in the Catholic Church, even a struggle about that. I'm happy to unpack that a little later, but that's the fundamental starting point, is like, do we start with the human person and who that human person is as created in the image and likeness of God? And then when I teach this to my students, I tell them, all means all. There are no exceptions. There are no small print. There's no small print here. that every human person is created in the image of God. And that is our fundamental starting point. That's where the conversation needs to begin.
Thank you. I'm gonna press you on that struggle right away. Yeah,
Sure.
I think I mean, Michael mentioned, right, speaking to a bishop this week that broke with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on this issue, particularly around a piece of legislation called the Equality Act. And yet, right, we look at the more data, right, like the numbers show, right, that an overwhelming majority of Catholics support non-discrimination protections. That's just right. And yet we have a singular U.S. Catholic bishop coming out in support of a piece of legislation that would do exactly that. Can you talk about that tension? Like what's happening there, right? Why, if all means all, right? Like if there is in our social ethic, right, is to protect the human dignity of every individual, every person, right, and the land and all of creation, right, then why is there such a disconnect between the laity and the leadership? Why is there? Talk about that struggle a little more.
Okay. I think one of the easiest ways to understand this, I think, is that for those bishops who are more traditionally minded, there is a fear that protecting gay persons means approving of gay sex. And I'm using the restrictive term, not LGBTQ, because that's the way in which more traditionally minded persons talk. That they believe that if we enshrine protections for the gay or lesbian person, that we're somehow giving an endorsement for immoral behaviors that are not approved of by the Catholic Church. And so they draw so they kind of collapse the distinction between protecting the person and approving behavior. Now, when I challenge them on this and I say, well, look, I mean, the Catholic Church argues for the rights of the incarcerated without ever approving of criminal behavior, then you get a more nuanced understanding or a deeper understanding. And that is, they believe that signaling support for LGBTQ inclusive non-discrimination legislation somehow leads to a greater social approval or acceptance, or creates a more welcoming climate for the acceptance of immoral behavior. And so I think what it does is they're fearful that this creates a climate where someone can see that, oh, society is okay with these kinds of behaviors, and that becomes the kind of the pushback that you're seeing among those who are more traditionally minded. Now, on the other side, then, as people are saying, well, wait a minute. I mean, these are human beings that we're talking about. And I think that the fear on the other side is that when they look at an LGBTQ person, they're not seeing a person, they're seeing what someone would call a walking sex act. And so they're so fixated upon the sex and the sexuality that they're not seeing the full person. That's the kind of conversation that's going on in the Catholic Church right now. And I think the real struggle between those who see LGBTQ persons in the fullness of their person, or those who focus simply upon certain sexual behaviors that they find morally problematic. And that divide then informs how people fall out, where they shake out when it comes to non-discrimination activities or non-discrimination legislation.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much. Which brings me back to Father Dennis. You've done a lot of significant work in bringing about non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ students at the college and university level. And while that has been, I mean, I celebrate that. A lot of folks celebrate that work and that progress. I'm certain that there has been some pushback from folks in the church, whether directly in the academy or beyond. Can you share a little bit about like what some of that pushback has been and how you've navigated that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, whatever the world is fighting about shows up at a university somehow. I wasn't at DePaul a week when we didn't have an issue with an art exhibit in our art museum of Palestinian artists, and my Jewish students were incredibly offended because their history had been misrepresented. And Israel's history had been misrepresented, but it was an artistic intent And we were suddenly in the middle of a much larger world fight that was playing out in a very particular way with the people on a campus. And this is one of the larger issues that humanity is trying to work through right now, right? And not just in the United States. The Catholic Church is a worldwide organization. And there are parts of the world where people are still put to death for this. And the church could be shut down entirely with its members put to death if they came out publicly in support of it. It's to be in the leadership of a worldwide organization, and that complexity is no small matter as the world works through many of its issues. And so I'm at a university, I'm used to the world thinking through things on our campus, and somehow the difficulty of that. When you lead one of these enterprises, what you find out is that you spend a lot of your life trying to share one set of concerns with another group, and then going from that group, and you do a lot of shuttle diplomacy when you lead these organizations, of helping people find the human place in this, and helping them realize that they're kind of caught up in a much larger fight. It's not just personal. And so there's a lot of trying to get these things back to the humanity of it all. I just finished reading Claudia Rankine's book, Just Us. I don't know if you've seen it. She's the poet from Yale. And it's a really moving book that encourages people into very complex conversations. And she herself has to push herself into complex conversations. And in her case, around race and around privilege. But really hard conversations with people that she knows don't agree with her, because she can see that front and center. And part of what a university has to do and call people to is to summon the courage to enter the conversation and to find each other in the midst of it, and especially at a Catholic university. What Bryan had said a moment ago is such the heart of it, that we have to remember help people remember and see the humanity, to see the pain, to find out the fear of change and why, what's actually are people afraid of, and to engage the questions and put them on a table. And if a university doesn't do that, then what should? And so that becomes part of how you lead these organizations, is you remind them of the purpose of the university, and you remind them of the humanity that's at stake.
If I can follow up on that for just a moment, Dennis. I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I teach a course at Fordham, it's called Homosexuality and Christian Ethics. And what I tell my students is that there isn't like a yes and a no. We study 7 different positions that one finds Christians taking on issues of LGBTQ inclusion. And we read everything from the Westboro Baptist Church to queer theology. And as I tell the students, if I do my job well, you're going to spend most of the semester studying a position that you disagree with. But you have to learn the arguments and why people who hold that position, why do they hold that position? What are the warrants that they have? And how do the other positions critique that one? And then at the very end of the semester, they have to write a synthesis paper articulating their position and where they fall and why. And it's something that's very interesting to me, that you would think that most college students who enter into the course, that they would have a more like liberal orientation. But as I tell people, most Fordham students are not as liberal as they think they are, because they really haven't thought about it a great deal. But it's also very important for the LGBTQ students in the course, because it's the first time that many of them have had their experience as the object of serious thought and exploration. And for all of the students, it's amazing to me, something that's very painful to me, is that many of them have never even heard of Stonewall and what the Stonewall events were about. And I asked them the question, I say, okay, why do you think, because you're all going, you've all went to very good schools, you all studied US history, why is it that you never learned of Stonewall? And I leave them with the observation that when you teach a person's history, a group's history, you validate their existence. And so the idea that the university, by exploring these questions, even if our students The goal isn't to make them advocates on one side or the other. The goal is to make them better informed. And when they become better informed, then they can enter into a more productive, robust conversation that's informed by people's lived experiences and not by simple unreflected prejudices that people have simply because of just growing up in American society. So I think you're absolutely right. This is one of the most important things a university can do to create a better, more welcoming climate for LGBTQ students and for all of our students. I think for all of our students, I think that's important.
Thank you both for that. Michael, I want to kind of follow up on those pieces, right? One on the complexity that Father Dennis talked about, but also that work of students like coming to their own positions after studying a wide variety of positions. And you've been studying a number of position papers that have been flooding out from different parts of the church over the last several weeks, notably the Tyler Clementi letter opposing and condemning bullying of LGBTQ youth. It's been signed on by a number of bishops. I've lost track of the number. And religious orders, and I believe the Jesuit Society of Canada most recently. What impact do you think that would have had for you, right, as when you were young, right, like whether in undergrad or in high school, right? And what do you think that speaks of the progress we're making, and is it enough at this point?
Yeah, the Tyler Clementi Foundation statement against LGBT bullying. I think my Jesuit bosses at America would like me to say that the Jesuits of the U.S. have signed on as well. So we got the Jesuits on board. No, it's an interesting question, and one that I kind of think about in terms of what Father Bryan just said about LGBT history, sort of providing something for LGBT youth to know that like they aren't going through this for the first time. So for the past 5 years, I've been researching the Catholic Church's response to the HIV and AIDS crisis. Father Bryan actually helped out for an interview with that project. And, I produced this podcast that kind of goes into some of those stories about how gay and lesbian Catholics responded to the crisis, how the church reacted, and the forthcoming book kind of gets deeper into those stories. But that for me has been a really powerful lesson in, even for myself, having covered this beat for a decade now, I'm still learning a lot of this history because it wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't really taught in university either. And just knowing that other people went through this and made it work. So I'm gay and Catholic, and for a long time, especially in my kind of teenage years and 20s, it felt very new to me. Like I'm the first person to try to make this work. But then, of course, that's completely ridiculous and not true. But I really had to seek out those stories. So I think resources that kind of provide this history, even some of the like negative history that might not be as pleasant to learn, it does provide sort of a backdrop and lessons for us today as we navigate this. So I think getting those stories out there, talking about how gay and lesbian Catholics, LGBT Catholics have been part of the church since the beginning, I'm sure, and especially kind of more recent examples of modern history, I think could be useful to remind young people that there is a place for them and that, in fact, they're not that new. There's been other people kind of navigating this before. So that's kind of been the point of my project, and I'm glad to hear that it's certainly happening in universities still.
That's great. Thank you. I think I said this last week, but say it again, right? Like speaking of like, maybe there were gay Catholics at the very beginning, probably. When I was going through confirmation, I was 17 because my family was like super late on a lot of things. And so like, it wasn't until I got to undergrad, like, I'm going to finish this because we never got across the finish line here. And I Googled gay Catholic saint to try to find a confirmation saint. It was Saint Sebastian for some reason came up, and that's why I ran with it. Like, unconfirmed mystery, but I ran with it, and we're still here today. But I appreciate that because I mean, same, right? Like my experience was one where there's not a lot of info, right? There's not a lot of history that's just readily available, and it's scary, right? Like to be the gay kid in 8th grade. I just remember this being my own experience. Gay kid in 8th grade, like walking to the human sexuality part of the library and like, where are these gay books? Like, no one look at me, and like the librarian's like, do you need help? Like, no, like I do not, I need no help, leave me alone. And if there is structured space, right, like what Father Dennis has talked about and what Father Bryan has talked about on campus, if there's structured space for students to engage and to be validated, right, in their experiences, or to see people other than them validated, there's room for dialogue and understanding. And these big battles we're fighting in the public square about how to protect the oppressed, the marginalized, the disinherited, the temperature on that cools down more significantly because like, no, I see you and I see that you're human. And thus, let's talk about how we can make sure that you are safe, that you go into a store and you're not kicked out because you're trans, that you can access education like everybody else. Like you won't be fired from your job because your employer finds out that you're dating someone of the same sex. That's where we're trying to get to that, right? Like that's the place we want to be, where everyone is safe and whole, and their full human dignity is protected and affirmed. And so I guess my final question for everyone, we can just go around, is given like what we've seen, right, there's significant progress, right? It's not the 80s. It's not, right, I note the 80s because of, right, the Conference of the Doctrine of Faith put out a horrific letter that seemed like it was echoing back to just a week ago. And so there seems like there's been a lot of progress since then. And then there's some backsliding at the same time. Are y'all hopeful? Are you hopeful for the future of the church and its ability to protect LGBTQ people?
Well, pregnant pauses shouldn't fill that space. So I am. Because a few years ago, I actually gave a talk about how much change I've seen socially in my lifetime. To watch what's happened for the African American community, even though so much more needs to happen. But I grew up in Detroit, and I remember the riots of Detroit firsthand. That is a childhood memory for me. To watch women's advancement, even though so much more needs to happen and so much isn't in place, to watch how much that's changed since the 1960s. I've watched many different areas of humanity painfully addressed and make progress, and go backwards and make progress again. But I've watched that happen, and so my trust in this is that humanity seems to come back again and again when something isn't right, and there is nothing that grabs the attention as your opening of this session today, of young people that are ending their lives because of the pain of how they're treated in the world or ignored by the world. Or for my own sister who runs a shelter for homeless, and overwhelmingly it's young people of the LGBTQ community whose families have thrown them to the street. It's those stories in themselves call out for human hearts to step forward. And I do believe in humanity that has the kind of heart that does step forward, even as we lose ground and then try to regain it.
Thank you.
I'm hopeful, but I phrase it slightly differently. I'm not sure that I have that humanity always gets it right. But I'm hopeful for two reasons. One a very personal reason, and that is I am a publicly gay man who is a Catholic priest. And when I was first ordained back in 1983, I could not imagine there being a time when I could be publicly known as being a gay man and being a priest. It's not to say that it's an easy road, and it's not saying that it's totally accepted, but I have to say that my experience of being a publicly gay, priest, that in itself is something that could not have happened 40 years ago. That in itself is a mark of progress. The other thing that gives me hope is that Frederick Douglass once said that when there is no struggle, there is no progress. And so the very fact that these issues are the struggle itself in the Catholic Church is a sign of progress. The struggle itself is a sign of progress, because every religious denomination that has moved to a more accepting or affirming position on LGBTQ matters has gone through a period of intense struggle where the messages were contradictory and conflicting and contested and messy. The Episcopal Church went through this. The Lutheran Church went through this. The Presbyterian Church went through this. The Methodists are in it right now. And we can't expect that the Catholic Church is going to be any different. That as painful as it is, as messy as it is, and as crazy as it is, that in itself is a necessary place to be in order to come to a more accepting place. So the very fact that things are really muddy at the present time, that in itself, to me, is a sign of progress and a sign of hope, because it's the necessary stage that one has to go through in order to come to a more affirming place.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just quickly, kind of to wrap up, I would say yes, I am hopeful. I think it is challenging. You know, for the Plague podcast, I got to know Father William Hart McNichols, who's a renowned iconographer, engaged in HIV and AIDS ministry in the 80s, another openly gay priest, kind of a great example of kind of sticking it out and claiming your space in the church and dealing with the consequences that come from that. But I asked him if he thought it was easier today for LGBT Catholics than it was in the 1980s with all the challenges that were happening at the time. And I expected him to say yes, of course, because there's been so much societal progress. But he actually said no, he thinks it's more difficult. And he says that because the church has responded to that societal progress, he thinks, by kind of cracking down on the LGBT community. And he said that it was a little easier back then to kind of sneak under the radar and live your life and do ministry. And today, he said he sees it as a very difficult endeavor. So that was interesting to hear. But at the same time, I know several young men in their 20s and 30s who are either priests today or studying for the priesthood, who are just very understanding of this issue and seek to, you know, engage in an inclusive ministry when they're ordained, really to bring in the LGBT community and serve as allies and make LGBT people and their families know that they're welcome. So there are these bright spots for the future of the church that will be a nice complement to people like Father Dennis and Father Bryan, who are already engaged in this work. So I think, you know, the momentum will build and we'll see in LGBT inclusive spaces kind of emerging in all different parts of the church. So that does give me hope that there's, you know, brighter days on the horizon.
Thank you, Michael. Thank all of you. I've really appreciated this conversation. And I think similarly, right, like this moment at the tail end of Lent, this Palm Sunday is right around the corner in 2 days, in case anyone's, you know, listening to this live at least. You'll be a little late if you're listening to the recording, but Lent often feels like a reminder, right, of what Mahalia Jackson would call that tedious journey. And yet that invitation to God, walk with me, Lord, on this very tedious, this most tedious journey. And I mean, it's the story of the gospel in many ways, right? Like Jesus walks this tedious journey, right, of ministry all the way up to Calvary. And while there are points of joy along that journey, the end of the story is not, the immediate end of the story is not sweet. Good Friday is not sweet. Good Friday is the pinnacle of the tedious journey. And I think there's a lot of ways in which LGBTQ people, LGBTQ youth, resonate with that story of struggle, of trying to pave a way forward for inclusion and for justice and for liberation. Right? It's the heart, like I would argue, right, the heart of what Jesus offers us in Luke 4, that the captive will be set free, that the blind shall receive sight, that the year of the Lord's favor was declared in that moment. And yet, right, like where is it, right? Like it's been about 2,000 years, give or take, since Jesus picked up the scroll of Isaiah 61 in that synagogue that day. And yet liberation has not yet been achieved for all people, but we struggle on. And Lent, I think, helps us serve as a reminder of our collective duty to struggle together until everyone is free. And speaking of which, I'm going to offer for anyone who's listening to this, who themselves might be struggling, with mental health or thoughts of suicide. The Trevor Project has a resource. The Trevor Lifeline is available online. The phone number is 1-866-488-7386. Again, that's 1-866-488-7386. That's available 24/7, 365 days out of the year. I'm going to thank you again, Father Dennis, Father Bryan, and Michael for joining today for this conversation. Next week, we'll be convening a different panel for the final panel in this series to talk about the trans community and the witness of dignity, the witness of holiness that they bring to the church. And so stay tuned. If you want any updates from the Human Rights Campaign, you can text FAITH to 472-472. But otherwise, we'll catch you next week, Good Friday at 1 p.m. Thank you, everyone.